Imagine that you are the CEO of a business and your company was just hit with ransomware. Imagine that your family member, thank you. Imagine that one of your family members' identity was just stolen. Or imagine you just broke up with your girlfriend or your boyfriend and they've hacked your phone, your computers, they've broken into your accounts. Who do you turn to? Law enforcement? Police officers? That is the last place that most people turn to lately. I am a police officer. One of the reasons that I started presenting or wanted to present this is because of that fact. Because law enforcement is the last place that somebody wants to turn. I started with a tweet. This is the simple tweet that I sent out asking folks if they needed my help to contact me. It says, if you are a victim of cybercrime or you suspect that a significant other or an ex may be accessing your devices or network, please contact me. I will walk you through it. I can take the police hat off and we can talk about your options and how to protect yourself. I am here to help. With those words, my inbox was flooded immediately with people asking for my help. Yeah, it got interesting really quickly. So for me as a law enforcement officer, that breaks my heart because I don't want people to not trust me, law enforcement, as their place to turn to. I want them to trust me. I want them to come to the police for a place to help. But there are a lot of reasons why they don't. So as I said, this tweet, you can see it got 244 retweets, 603 likes. That was over 2 days. I had dozens and dozens of messages in my inbox for people saying, I need help. How can you help me? They didn't even know how or who to contact. Here are some of the statistics on cybercrime. This is by type of crime. And you can see the second one there is personal data breaches. So somebody has breached your personal information. And then ransomware and malware towards the end. Here are some of the statistics by country. You can see China by far has more loss than any other country in 2017. So I'm going to walk you through cybercrime. What do law enforcement officers have to deal with when we're dealing with cybercrime? First of all, federal laws. This Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or CFAA, is the primary law by which we govern cybercrime. And this was last amended in 2008. Can you imagine not patching your computer or making any changes to your computer since 2008? That's the same with this law. All of the changes that we've made and all of the growth in cybercrime, and yet we haven't changed this law since 2008. This is one of my recent cases. This is a suspect that I investigated. And he's saying here that this is the best job in the whole world. He's speaking about cybercrime, cyber fraud. And yet, this bottom line says, I will take my chances with the feds, thank you. Cyber criminals know that law enforcement officers are not adequately equipped to investigate these crimes. So why aren't they? The same suspect here, Michael O'Guiney. He stole more than $650,000 in 2 years. All credit card fraud, skimmers. When I did the forensics on this case, the one file that he stored everything in was this bottom one, and it's called verybigfraudpackage.zip. He made it very easy for me to find all of the fraud that he was committing. Michael O'Guiney got 14 years in prison. 14 years. Let's compare that sentence to some other fraud cases. Here are some other folks that have been sentenced with 14 years in prison. This first man up here got 14 years in prison for sexually assaulting 2 children. The second one, he's an international drug trafficker. He caused the death, the murder, and the beatings of hundreds of people, and yet he also got 14 years in prison. All of these crimes, 5 years in prison for hacking Yahoo, 14 years in prison for a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme in which he targeted the elderly. In this last one, convicted fraudster was sentenced for 5 years in prison for an $87 million Ponzi scheme. How do those relate? Those aren't even close in the crimes that they've committed. And then we can continue. 26-year-old hacker was sentenced to 334 years in prison. This particular hacker was working with Russian spies, and he ended up hacking several accounts. Then the Yahoo hacker was only sentenced to 5 years in prison. And then this recent one here at the bottom, a hacker received 14 years in prison just for running the Scan for You service. So there is a huge discrepancy in the sentences that we give to hackers and criminals in cybercrime. So what is wrong with our current laws and our legal practices? Our laws are outdated. They don't reflect what's happening currently and the trends that are currently happening. The sentences are subject to the judge who gives them. There's no guideline on what has to be given. So that's why we see the wide discrepancies here. And then lastly, most attorneys, if I'm working a cybercrime case, I have to explain to them what a Bitcoin is, what an IP address is, how do we attribute those to that attacker. So technology is not widely understood. And then you have federal jurisdictions that vary on the amount of crime that they'll take. So some jurisdictions, you have to have over $100,000 in theft or loss before they will even adapt a case. Some of them, it's over $300,000. Can you imagine having to attribute that amount of loss to some of these cybercrime cases that we see? It's very hard. So who investigates cybercrime in the United States? Per presidential directive, there are 2 main agencies who investigate cybercrime: the Secret Service and the FBI. There are others that are able to investigate those as well if it falls within their jurisdiction. So you can have Immigration and Customs, U.S. Postal Service, and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms as well, as many others. Here are the types of cybercrime that some of these agencies investigate. So you can see the FBI and the Secret Service end up investigating a whole lot of these. Postal Inspection, ATF, and Immigrations and Customs will get involved if it's in their jurisdiction. So that's on a federal level. What about state and local jurisdictions? Are they able to investigate cybercrime? Yes. So local law enforcement, they can investigate the smaller cases. Federal agencies get involved when there are larger cases or if it crosses state lines. So some of the things that local law enforcement will investigate are harassment, stalking, child exploitation, computer forensics. State law enforcement can investigate all except for anything involving terrorism. And then the federal agencies can investigate everything. So we have the police officers. Obviously, the United States has thousands of police officers. So what kind of training is available for law enforcement? We have a lot of training available, free training. We have NCFI, the National Computer Forensics Institute, which is where I was trained at. This is run by the United States Secret Service, and they provide this free for law enforcement on a local or state level. So they will send local or state agencies to this training facility. They will pay for their travel, they'll pay for their hotel, they give them a per diem every day, and they send them home with all of the equipment necessary to investigate those crimes. FLETC, or the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, primarily used by the FBI. Again, the same thing. They train local and state law enforcement and send them home with the tools necessary to investigate these crimes. Then there's NCFTA and then the NW3C. Both of these, again, free law enforcement training. What's the one disconnect in all of this? All of these officers have to go through a law enforcement academy when they first become police officers. Do you know the one thing that is not taught in the police academy? Cybercrime is not even touched in the police academy today. So what's the problem? We have the officers, we have the training, we have the presidential directive that says we can investigate these crimes. So what's wrong? Why can't we investigate these crimes? Here are the 4 flaws in thinking in the US government and law enforcement. 1, budget. Most law enforcement agencies do not have the budget to sustain a staff member or multiple staff members who are dedicated to just investigate cybercrime. Most detectives or investigators, even myself, we have a full-time caseload above and beyond the cybercrime that we investigate. So I may investigate theft, counterfeiting, and then I may go investigate, an incident response or something that's related to cybercrime. So I'm not specialized in that area. So like most detectives, they work a rape, they work a homicide, and then maybe they can get to cybercrime at some point, although that's very low on their list. The second flaw in thinking, staffing. Most agencies are not going to dedicate that one person, like I said. But they're also not willing to send these officers to that free training that I just discussed, because they can't lose a detective for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months, depending on the training. So even though it's free, paid for, and it's going to help their agency, they won't utilize that training because they can't lose that officer. The third flaw, statistics. Think about the number of crimes that your average detective can investigate on a daily basis. Quite a few. They may bounce around 10 or 12 different cases. They're investigating a bank robbery, or they're investigating a skimmer, or they're investigating, a local rape. They can wrap those cases up a lot quicker than they can a cybercrime case. Cybercrime cases take a while. You have to issue subpoenas, get the IP addresses, attribute it to somebody, track, cryptocurrency. So it takes a while to investigate. So statistics play a big part. As police officers, at the end of the year, our bosses want to know, how many cases did you close? How many crimes did you solve? And if I say 2, my boss is not going to be happy with me. And then the fourth flaw in thinking is command staff. We have senior law enforcement officials who barely know how to turn their own computer on, let alone how to investigate these crimes. So they don't understand the benefit of sending those officers to this training. They don't understand that cybercrime is up and coming, and that in the next year it will probably populate about 50% of what they're investigating. They don't understand that, and so they're not willing to spend the money to utilize the staff and to not worry about those statistics. The next big issue, nerds and cops. We don't mix, right? Usually, if you are into computers and you want to investigate computer crimes or you want to work on computers, your first thought is not going to the police academy. And on the flip side, most law enforcement officers do not set out in their career to investigate cybercrime. That's not the fun thing to investigate. They want to go investigate the homicides, the bank robberies, the fun stuff, as they say. Cybercrime is not fun to most people. So let's talk about the process. When we go out to investigate a cybercrime, as law enforcement officers, we are trained to investigate cybercrime as a cop. We're trained to go out, gather the evidence, and leave. We forget that there are real people and real emotions involved. And so we are not trained to speak to the employees, to give them the next steps, to talk about what's going to happen and who they should call next. Because I'm not going to go in and fix their system. They have to have somebody that does that. And so we don't discuss, do you contact the news media, or why that's bad? What's going to happen to your system next? What should you do? Who should you call? We're not used to doing that. And so our first impressions when we go onto a scene for cybercrime are usually pretty bad. They're worried about business and whether or not their business is going to be back up and running that day, because they're losing money with every hour that their system is down. So our first impressions are usually really bad. So as law enforcement, how do we create that trust? What can we do to help folks want to come to us when there's a cybercrime attack? We have to rethink as law enforcement how we do things. And this is not unique with cybercrime. I think that we've lost perspective as law enforcement on why we're here and why we investigate these things. It has to be a top-down change. So it has to come from the command staff. And command staff down has to understand that this is a priority, that this is going to be a big deal, and we need to spend the time and the manpower to fix this. So what about the private sector? Why are we not utilizing them? I have lots of friends who work in threat intelligence, and every single one of them have told me that not once have they worked with law enforcement on a case. Typically, it's them giving law enforcement information, and then law enforcement says thanks and see you later, and they never see them again. That's unacceptable. We should be utilizing the private sector more as law enforcement. The private sector excels at law enforcement. If you listen to Miko's talk this morning, the stuff that he was saying is exactly what law enforcement should be thinking about, but we don't. They give their people incentives. They specialize in areas, countries, threat actors. They understand the processes and procedures because they employ people who specialize in each of these areas. They give these people money that law enforcement officers don't get. So most law enforcement officers like myself, obviously I'm not in this for the money, government pay, but at some point, most law enforcement officers will transfer over to the private sector because the money is better over there. We cannot keep people in government positions without incentivizing them to be there. The private sector also has specialized teams. They have up-to-date hardware and software. This is something the government doesn't have. We don't update our systems, our laptops, our software, our hardware. And if I want a specialized program to investigate cybercrime, it's like pulling teeth to get that program, to get somebody to spend that money, which is hard. So I end up going to open source tools. This is a paper that the DoD released. It's called Strategy for Operating in Cyberspace. And with this, the military is saying we need to partner with other agencies and the private sector. How many of you in the private sector have ever partnered with law enforcement on a case before? And not just given them information, but actually collaborated on how to solve a problem. This should be a greater priority for us. Partnerships. How can we form that lasting partnership? Like I said, in law enforcement, we are so bad about just taking the information and not giving back. So in order to provide these partnerships and make them lasting partnerships, we're going to have to collaborate. I would love to sit down at a table with a group of private sector folks, companies, and learn more about threat actor groups and where that can help my investigations. But it's just unheard of. So, in closing, there has to be a fundamental shift in thinking about cybercrime. We really have to work at getting that top-down change. We have to make sure that people understand that this is a priority. In the UK, which is where we see most of the cybercrime hit before it hits the United States, they're seeing over 50% of their cases are cybercrime related already. So it's only a matter of time before that hits the same percentage across the world. You can help change this process. We all have to get involved. We all have to make those changes. So, in the United States, we go to our congressmen, we go to our senators and ask them to change the laws. We're going to have to change the laws. We're going to have to change the processes in which this occurs. We have to change that CFAA. And then the private sector and law enforcement, we have to create a lasting partnership for the greater good. This is something that we all have to work at. So if you're in the private sector and you have a chance to reach out to your local law enforcement, reach out. And then in the same respect, the task force that I'm on, we are constantly reaching out to private sector folks and asking them to come in and teach at our task force meetings. We want to hear from the private sector. And so, we're trying to make that established connection with private sector in my area, and I'm hoping that others will too. So we can all learn from each other. We have to stop worrying about those statistics. As law enforcement, we're so focused on the next big bust. You know, where did we get that $1 million worth of cocaine from? You know, who was able to bust that drug ring? We have to stop focusing on that and focus more on cybercrime cases and not worrying about the short-term picture, worrying more about the long-term picture. We need dedicated units. One of the reasons that I was so excited to speak here today is because I believe Japan is doing it right. Tokyo Metro Police have a dedicated unit with hundreds of law enforcement officers specifically dedicated to cybercrime. That's amazing to me. That is something that needs to be done everywhere and should be done. You have to focus those units. We have the ability in the United States to do that. Like I said, all of these folks that the Secret Service and the FBI trains are mostly local and state law enforcement officers. We could start task force in our states, multi-state jurisdictional task forces. But we haven't done that yet. We're really bad about collaborating in the United States. So I was really excited to hear that Japan does that. And like I said earlier, most officers are so tied up on the other cases that they don't get the chance to investigate cybercrime cases. If you can close 10 other cases in the time that you could one cybercrime case, they're going to go for the 10 cases because they know at the end of the day, their boss is going to look at those statistics and be happier with the 10 cases versus the one case. I started noticing that this was a big issue. And so I ended up developing a training course for law enforcement in the United States. It's a 3-hour-long training course. And it covers what is an IP address? What is a Bitcoin? How can you investigate these crimes? What do you do to respond to a ransomware attack? And that's been really widely accepted, and I've trained over 1,600 police officers so far just in my state on how to investigate that. I still get requests from local law enforcement agencies. They'll call me and say, "Hey, Nicole, I have this stalking case. I'm really not sure where to go with this. Can you help me?" Yes, absolutely. It's something that I think that we need to work on more, and we need to get lots of people in this sector involved.